Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. You can help us by supporting the podcast by either leaving us a 5-star review at Amazon. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything, which is my reason for doing many things in life. Or you can support us through Ko-fi, which is a one-off donation to help with my crippling Coke habit. As much as I enjoy Aldi Cola, I'd like to buy Dr. Pepper from time to time, and you can get that on ko-fi.com/historyhack. We also have Patreon, where there are many new perks. Apparently, Alina's trying to get me to sell my bath water, so you can get that or other things. And that is at the patreon.com/historyhack. Again, you'll find that in the show notes. And we will have our shiny new website, historyhack.co.uk, in which Steve is doing some frightening new imagery and merchandise, including scary pictures of me. So if you have a ginger desire, no one I meet ever seems to, but if you do please go and check out the website. And so, now we're moving on to Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, who's here today to talk to us about the Cleopatras. So, Lloyd, how are you doing?
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
When we talk about Cleopatra, though, everybody immediately thinks, we were saying this just before we came on air, Elizabeth Taylor, she is just sort of the Cleopatra, but she's not the only one. Obviously not Elizabeth Taylor, but that Cleopatra isn't the only Cleopatra. There's 6, 7 others, isn't there?
That's right. Well, in historical terms, the Cleopatra, the Liz Taylor Cleopatra that we know, it becomes an icon for us now. She was actually the 7th of a whole dynasty of women called Cleopatra. It was the familial name in the house of Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic dynasty, who was the last ruling dynasty of Egypt before its annexation by Rome. And what I wanted to do in this new book was to actually put the famous Cleopatra the 7th, into her context, because I think very often she has been portrayed as almost kind of like a lone wolf figure, an exceptional woman who stands out in a world of patriarchy and tries to mold for herself an ambitious enterprise of becoming essentially queen of the world. And, she got within a hair's breadth of doing that. But what I've argued in my book, and it's very much a feminist take on history, is that Cleopatra the 7th was not alone in that. And actually, we can understand Cleopatra the 7th better when we put her in the context of her family's history, where we see from the 2nd century onwards down to 30 BC, when Cleopatra the 7th died, we can see this group of extraordinarily powerful and remarkable Egyptian queens who dominated the political world of Egypt, and for much of the Hellenistic world, in fact. It was a period, really, when queenship was in its golden age, because the majority of the Ptolemies, the kings themselves, were actually pretty poor rulers. And this was the time when girl power, if you like, really came into its own. They completely and utterly dominated their husbands. And I don't mean that in any kind of, carry-on sense, the harridan wife or that, sort of thing. I really mean that political power was in the hands of these very, very adept and brilliant women. Not without their flaws, God knows. They were a ruthless bunch, they really were. But I think it's a moment in women's history that has been too cavalierly overlooked. And it's kind of interesting, when I was writing the book, I was looking at the historiography who had written about these women before. And of course, all the greats, who had dealt with the Hellenistic period had. So Edwin Bevan, back in the 1920s, he'd written a book on the Ptolemaic dynasty, and he calls all of the Cleopatras Hyrcanian tigers. He says about them, ruthless killers, essentially. And this is a tradition that's gone through the historiography of the 20th and into the 21st century as well. And I think it says far more about the men who are writing the histories than it does about the women themselves. Because ultimately, these women are tarnished as being harridans, viragos, overstretching their limits, being murderous, poisonous, whatever it might be, all these pejoratives. And their biggest crime is the fact that they were women, of course, and historiography has to get over that, because here we've got a group of very, very successful rulers, regardless of sex. They were fantastic rulers. But it's because of their sex that I think that they're really interesting. How did they achieve power? How did they maintain power for 200 years in this world, which was entirely patriarchal?
Yes, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is The Cleopatras, and it is going to be one you're going to want to keep an eye on and one you're going to want to read. This is a very interesting time period. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt is one of the best known and least known dynasties that you can find. Everybody sort of knows about it or knows things about it. They'll be surprised. Some people will be surprised to know that this is like the things they know about ancient history are actually Ptolemaic things. And I think it's so true what you're talking about in terms of female leadership in the ancient world being ignored. And that is such a crime, especially when you're talking about the continent of Africa, because you not only have the Ptolemaic rulers in the north, but you have the Kentuckys in Nubia as well. So the tradition is very strong here.
The Nubian queens of the slightly later period are astonishing women.
Absolutely. But sticking with Hellenism at the second, what was the world like for a young woman in Syria and Egypt at this time?
Well, the women of the royal families of the Ptolemies and their sworn enemies, the Seleucids, who ruled Syria and much of the former Achaemenid Persian Empire, they were at loggerheads, and the women essentially knew that their lot in life was to be part of the politicking of their of the male members of their family. The first Cleopatra that we have, for instance, she's known as Cleopatra Syra. She wasn't Egyptian at all. She was a Seleucid princess, and she was married into the Egyptian royal family by her father Antiochus III, who was one of the great sort of military leaders of the Hellenistic world, and he wanted to try to make some kind of peace alliance with Egypt. Because the wars between Egypt had been dragging on for such a long time, it was thought that by marrying a daughter into the Ptolemaic house, then that would perhaps smooth things out for a while. It's an age-old story, isn't it? Of a foreign princess being sent to a foreign court and having to acclimatize and learn a new system entirely. But Cleopatra Syra, Cleopatra the First, she did it brilliantly well. She was she could only have been about 18 when she married Ptolemy V, who himself was younger. He was about 14 at the time. So they were complete strangers to one another. Their wedding was celebrated with great lavishness and pomp and circumstance in Gaza, of all places. And then she took a ship and she went to Alexandria with her new husband. Alexandria, of course, was the capital of Egypt at the time, and it really was the greatest city on earth in the 2nd century BCE. It was the center of learning. The great library, the Museon, was there. The great Basilisa, the palace of the Ptolemies. And even though she would have come from a really impressive urban environment herself, cities like Antioch, for instance, in Syria, nevertheless, they paled into insignificance compared to Alexandria and the real wonders of that city. But, she had to learn a kind of new way of operating. Everybody spoke Greek. That was a good common point, at least. All of these dynasties were Greek speakers. They were Macedonian of descent. But what Cleopatra Syra didn't know anything about, of course, was the Egyptian system at all. And for already 100 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty had thrived in Egypt because it had managed to somehow create a kind of almost bilingual persona for itself, so that it could play out to the Greek-speaking subjects in Alexandria and who lived in the Nile Delta, the settlers of Egypt, but then it could also speak, of course, to the local population of Egypt. So it kind of had a dual face, if you like, where a king and a queen would present themselves both in a kind of Greek form and in an Egyptian form as well. And that was a game that was carefully constructed by the Ptolemies, probably working with the Egyptian priesthood. And Cleopatra I had to learn all of that from scratch. But she seems to have done it very, very successfully. And certainly what we see in her reign with her husband, Ptolemy V, is an increasing power base that she creates at court. She brings with her, for instance, from Syria, some of her own ministers, including eunuchs, so these castrated men. They were absent from Egyptian tradition, but they were very, very common, of course, in Persian traditions.
I was going to say, even in the Persian
Syria,
period.
yeah, absolutely. So she brings these with her, and they become a kind of a strong power base for her to build on at the Egyptian court. And it seems that she becomes very, very popular with the Egyptians themselves, especially with the Alexandrians, to a point where halfway through the reign, the titles that she gets given morphs, and she's addressed as Queen Cleopatra, the beloved sister of Ptolemy. Now, that word sister is a really interesting one. She was his cousin, of course. She wasn't a sister. But the word sister in an Egyptian context could mean beloved, so beloved by King Ptolemy. But it also did have a resonance for the Ptolemies, because prior to Ptolemy V's reign, from Ptolemy II, the Ptolemaic kings had married their sisters. Royal incest was very much a fact of life for the Ptolemaic court. And this is because, again, they wanted to appeal to their two layers of subjects. In mythography, Isis, the great goddess, was married to her brother Osiris. And likewise, in a Greek context, the great god Zeus was married to his sister Hera. So there was a sort of divine precedent for this. And the Ptolemies were very keen to suggest that they were living gods. And so they played on this sort of divine incest. Now, when it came to Ptolemy V, he had no sisters to marry. And that's why he had to look elsewhere for a bride, a Syrian bride. This is why Cleopatra I comes in. And so they kind of make her an honorary sister, if you like. So in the rhetoric of the royal house, she is called beloved sister of the king.
Mm-hmm.
So she plays that role. And I think it's important to recognize that in Egypt, from millennia back, there had always been this kind of dualistic aspect to Egypt. Egypt was always called the Lord, the two lands, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And there was always really necessity to have a male and a female principal on the throne. So a pharaoh had to have a queen to do all the kind of cultic things, religious things that was needed. And so this is why, all pharaohs marry. And I think this is why, for the Ptolemies in particular, having that kind of brother-sister relationship on the throne was of especial importance.
Mm-hmm.
So when, after Ptolemy V died and Cleopatra I found herself on the throne as a regent for her son, Ptolemy VI, what she tried to do straight away was to ensure that he would marry his full-blood sister, and that's exactly what happens. Now, Cleopatra I gave birth to 3 children. We have Ptolemy VI, Cleopatra II, and then another boy, the younger boy, who becomes known as Ptolemy VIII, but he's known by everybody in antiquity as Potbelly, because he was a tremendously fat individual, very greedy individual, and not a pleasant man at all. More to say about that. But Cleopatra I ensured that in the next generation, the brother-sister incest would continue. So even though that was nothing that she had had an experience of, she ensured that was the way. So shortly before her death, she ensured that her elder son and her only daughter were married, and they sit on the throne together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the That's a problem to have. You have no sisters to marry, so you got to go and find someone else. That's
Yeah, you got to find one else.
classic.
But Cleopatra II first makes a really good deal of
Yeah.
the work, and at her death, her son calls himself by the title Ptolemy VI Philometor, which means the mother-loving son. He is,
Yeah.
So they often have these kind of titles which allude to the relationships they have with their
Yeah.
parents. Cleopatra II. Another remarkable woman. She really was a chip off the old block. She was throughout the time she was married to Ptolemy VI, very much the kind of instigator of bureaucratic and administrative detail. There was no detail that was too small for her to look at, it seems. And her natural role was kind of like an arbitrator between the two brothers. Especially so when these are all still kind of young teenagers at the moment. The second brother, Potbelly, is put on the throne besides Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II. So there's this very strange moment where we have three monarchs on the throne of Egypt at the same time, three siblings.
So how does she get through?
Yeah, well, she got through it very carefully, and she had to play a very careful game with it because the two brothers were very much opposing characters. Ptolemy VI was a very gentle and industrious king, whereas Ptolemy VIII was basically a tyrant, a maniac from the start. Cleopatra II loathed him, but she also realized that he could be very powerful and very dangerous. And so she had to play a very careful game of negotiating. Ptolemy the Eighth, Potbelly, was determined, however, to rule independently. And because Cleopatra II could see his ambition, she managed, with the support of Rome, who of course is the growing power in the Mediterranean at now the middle of the 2nd century BCE, she managed to oust Potbelly from the throne, and he's sent off to Cyrenaica in North Africa to rule his own little kingdom, as it were. Out of sight, certainly, but not out of mind. We find that Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II have a very strong mutual relationship. I think it's a love relationship, which again alerts us to the fact that these incestuous relationships are not in name only; they are physical relationships. And by her brother husband, Cleopatra II has a whole string of children. She has the eldest son, who we'll come back to, obviously called Ptolemy. They all are. We have another younger son called Eupator. We have an eldest daughter called Cleopatra Thea, and then a younger daughter called Cleopatra III. And all of these children really become the sort of power pawns in Cleopatra and Ptolemy's political game as well. Most notably, early on in their reign, when their eldest daughter is about 13, she is shipped back to Syria, the place of her grandmother's birth, where she marries one of the Seleucid kings. So you can see there's a kind of like a bridal exchange going in the other direction now as well. So really, from the middle of the 2nd century CE until the death of Cleopatra VII, the House of Ptolemy and the House of Seleucus are essentially the same thing. They're amalgamated essentially through the blood of these Cleopatras, these Ptolemaic princesses, who keep coming and going, essentially. A series of them are intermarried across the border. What gets difficult is when Ptolemy VI dies, then Cleopatra II is forced to accept Potbelly, her loathed brother, back on the throne. And he comes back to Egypt in triumph. She's, full of chagrin about the thing. She's about 40 years old at this period, and Potbelly must be about 35. So she realizes that in order to stay queen, she's going to have to placate her younger brother. And he marries her. and she gets pregnant by him almost straight away. And at the coronation of Potbelly, where he becomes Ptolemy VIII of the city of Memphis, which is perfectly timed for her, the queen, to give birth, and she gives birth to a son, whom she calls Memphites. At the coronation celebrations, Potbelly kills her eldest son by Ptolemy VI, his nephew.
Just randomly, or is it ritual?
No,
or what?
this is definitely something he's plotting to do, because, of course, what he doesn't want is to put the son of his brother on the throne. All his ambitions now go for his son Memphites. That's where his bloodline is. If you think about it, there's a very Darwinian sort of thing going on here. I mean, if you think about the wild, okay, if you think about a pride of lions, a lion will have in his harem, many lionesses, and she'll give birth to his cubs and he'll rear them. But if that lion is driven out by a rival lion, the first thing he does, and we've all seen this on the documentaries, is that he will systematically kill the cubs of his rival. It is a Darwinian theory that goes into human history as well. So this is what we've got going on, that essentially the stepdad kills off his stepson. And so Cleopatra II has now only her son Memphites, really, to ensure her future as a kind of queen mother in the future. But that's really not enough for Ptolemy, because Ptolemy's still a young man, Potbelly, and he wants more sons, of course, not just this one by his aging sister wife. And the next thing he does is really quite remarkable. He takes as a second wife, kings could be polygamous at this period, he takes his niece...
Back to the lion idea.
Yeah, he takes his niece, Cleopatra II's youngest daughter, Cleopatra III, and marries her. So we have the one man married both to the mother and the daughter at the one.
It's that country song, isn't it?
It is. It really is. I mean,
my own grandpa or something.
Absolutely, it really, really is. I mean, this is what incestuous families are all about. The family that sleeps together keeps together, as it were.
Okay, moving on.
It's part of the Ptolemaic propaganda system.
Yeah.
But it's more than that, because Cleopatra III is only about 17 or 18. And, of course, it means her big card that she can play is her fertility. And, in fact, she gives Potbelly 5 children altogether. Whereas, of course, poor Cleopatra II, time is running out for her. She is no longer fertile. So it's quite clear that Memphites was going to be her last boy. So all of the power shifts suddenly from the mother to the daughter, who is now kind of like the mother of the dynasty, if you like. And that is amplified by the next despicable act of Potbelly, when he murders Memphites. So the son he has by Cleopatra II, he kills him as well.
This is
in order basically to promote the sons of Cleopatra III.
Okay, so he's just doing the same thing over again. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, and can get away with it, of course. He in his titles, he called himself Euergetes, the benevolent one.
Oh wow!
But the Alexandrians, however, used to call him Kakergetes, which means the malevolent one. They hated him. He had a terrible reputation, not just within the royal family, but he was systematically killing off groups of individuals. For instance, he rounded up the Jews in Alexandria at one point and tried to massacre them en masse. I mean, he was a despicable character in all ways, grossly fat. In fact, there's this description that when a Roman ambassador came to Alexandria to have audience with him, the Roman ambassador just couldn't believe what he was looking at. Kind of this Jabba the Hutt.
I was going to say,
kind of figure.
You're going to Jabba the Hutt, aren't you?
Yeah, transparent in Mumu. He was a grotesque in so many ways, but played on that. But the strange thing is he was also a very erudite individual. He was very learned. He wrote books. He wrote poetry. But at the same time, this dark element to him. And
classic villain, basically. Classic supervillain, basically, is what we're talking about
classic supervillain, absolutely. It'd make a great film, it really would. And of course, Cleopatra the Third, she is very much sort of part and parcel with him. She really aligns herself completely with him because he's the only man available to her, and she realizes that all of her future lies with this relationship with her uncle husband. Now, of course, that doesn't bode well for the relationship between the mother and the daughter, both of whom are still queens on the throne. There's a kind of long period of hatred, and then things finally start to kind of calm down. And in the royal titulary, they are distinguished only by their titles. So Cleopatra II is known as Cleopatra the sister, and Cleopatra the Third is known as Cleopatra the wife. And that's the only way that they're distinguished, really.
Gotta love ancient history for those distinctions.
Absolutely, yeah. And even in the wall paintings, they look exactly the same as well. You know, there's no attempt to distinguish them whatsoever. But what's the next interesting thing is when Cleopatra II dies, quickly followed by her brother, Potbelly. But in his will, he allows Cleopatra III to choose for herself which of her sons will succeed him to the throne. And this is really a black joke.
Not the ones he's allowed to live.
Yeah. Indeed. Absolutely. But also because he knows that Cleopatra III loathes her eldest son, Ptolemy IX, Chickpea, as he was known in the family. And all of her affection was for her.
The entire family was called Hummus.
Exactly. Almost, yeah. And the younger son, Ptolemy X, who was just like his father, she adored. And so Potbelly knew that havoc would be created when Cleopatra tried to oust Chickpea and get her younger son on the throne. And that's exactly what she did. You know, it's like Potbelly could see all this happening. But the Alexandrian mob rebelled against that, and they forced Ptolemy X, the younger brother, out of the country. He fled to Cyprus. And so Chickpea he comes to the throne. And Cleopatra III loathes him. I mean, she simply knows him. We don't know why. We really don't. Sometimes there's just these moments, aren't there, where, parents just don't like a child. Well, this is certainly the case with Cleopatra III because she goes out of her way to cause him embarrassment and to belittle him. So on all the relief sculptures we have of the two of them as joint rulers, mother and son, she always is shown in the front position. Ptolemy the Ninth, Chickpea, always has to stand at the back of his mother, which is completely contrary to the way that things have been done in pharaonic Egypt for centuries and centuries and centuries. The pharaoh takes the prominent position. But worse than that, she manipulates his private life as well. So Chickpea, just like all Ptolemies, of course, as the king, marries his eldest sister, and her name, of course, is Cleopatra. We call her Cleopatra IV. And this, bizarrely enough, was a love match. They genuinely liked and probably loved each other. They had certainly two sons and a daughter together. We don't always know what happened to all of them. But Cleopatra III, the mother, forced this couple to divorce. And I think the rationale for getting them to divorce was because Cleopatra III feared, again, the ambitions of her daughter, Cleopatra IV. The generational conflict that goes on between these women is really quite astonishing. I think these women are all capable politicians, but what they cannot brook is any resistance from other women, younger women in the generation. So what we have is mother-daughter conflicts constantly. In this period. And so poor Cleopatra IV is forced to abandon the throne of Egypt, and she has to divorce Chickpea, but she does not go silently. And in fact, what she does is she raises an army of her own, out of her own money, and she goes to Syria where she marries a rival to the Syrian throne. Now, just before she arrived there, her own sister, another Cleopatra called Cleopatra Tryphina, had been married off to the king of Syria. So now we have in Syria 2 Ptolemaic princesses married to 2 Seleucid princes who are rivals to the throne. So, like, there's 2 halves now of this kind of
some might
this
say
horrible
civil war is looming.
Yeah, civil war.
Yes.
I mean, that's exactly it. And during this civil war, the 2 Ptolemaic princesses back their husbands, quite literally go to the battlefield with their husbands, and eventually kill each other off. They are both killed in these civil wars. And this is the way in which Cleopatra III operates. She's willing to send her daughters even into war zones so that she can maintain her position herself. And during the reign of Chickpea, where she really dominates everything,
I am loving all of the very sort of the names
she is
here.
forced to marry his very youngest sister, another girl called Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra the Moon, that means, who is a kind of like ingenue, and Cleopatra III thinks will be very quiet and won't create any fuss. During all of this period, Cleopatra III creates for herself more royal titles than any queen of Egypt who had ever gone before her. She just kind of stacks them up more and more and more. And very often she takes masculine titles as well. So she is called things like the Strong Bull of Horus, for instance. So this isn't obviously a feminine title at all.
I was going to say that's actually pharaohs used to be called take those names. But
that's right, exactly.
That actually makes sense, because pharaohs even had Hatshepsut. You couldn't be a queen to reign; you had to be pharaoh. So that makes sense.
There's no concept of a female pharaoh. So what Cleopatra does, just like Hatshepsut before her, is to basically usurp all of these titles. But the other thing that she does is that she promotes her own worship in temples throughout Egypt as well. So she becomes a living goddess. And in fact, she calls herself the new Isis. So she is the living embodiment of Isis on earth. So not just deified after her death, she is a living goddess. So that's the kind of power that we are dealing with under Cleopatra III. And she becomes so powerful that eventually she drives Chickpea off the throne, and she calls back to Egypt her youngest must-loved son, Ptolemy X, and he rules with her. But things are not happy, particularly between them. She discovers that actually he is so much like his father that he's really pretty intolerable and not a good king at all. The good thing that she does for him is that she gets him to marry his niece, Chickpea's daughter. Her name is Cleopatra V, of course, who is a young woman who is, like her grandmother and great-grandmother, a smart cookie. Really, really good. So while Ptolemy X proves to be a dreadfully bad king, his queen consort, Cleopatra V, is smart and holds the country together. The relationship between Ptolemy X and his mother, Cleopatra III, gets worse and worse and worse until the point comes where he murders her. She was about 80 years old, and we believe
it's a familiar
that he killed her by strangling her with his belt. Actually, so she's finally out of the picture. And
we've all been there. Come on, everything's going smoothly, and then just murder.
But the thing is,
stop nagging me.
Ptolemy doesn't know how to rule at all, because Cleopatra III has been doing everything. So what does he do? Well, he gives really the whole rulership over to his wife, Cleopatra V, who is now about 20 years old, and she's just brilliant. And when finally Ptolemy X dies, she becomes the queen in her own right, and this is the first time in Egypt's history properly when a woman becomes queen on her own. So it's not Cleopatra VII, but Cleopatra V that I'm really drawn to, because she was only a queen for a year by herself. before she was kind of forced to marry, because again, she couldn't conceive of a world where she could be an independent queen. She had to look for a husband.
She
And he
felt more
came in the
secure
form,
to go to the traditional route
precisely.
eventually.
But there was no way of thinking otherwise. I mean, how would the world function with just a woman on the throne?
Because
This dualism
foreign
in
policy
Egyptian
and
thought,
everything is like as well.
exactly everything
Yeah.
was needed that male principle there. But there wasn't anybody immediately around that she could marry, so they had a bit of a kind of like search for a bridegroom, and he was found in Rome. He was a son, probably, of Cleopatra's cousin. So he was a cousin of Cleopatra V, let's put it that way. And he comes back to Egypt not knowing anything about Egypt whatsoever, completely, Romanized individual. He's given the title Ptolemy the 12th, or Ptolemy the 11th, I beg your pardon. And on seeing him, Cleopatra V hates him straight away, loathes him straight away. And he loathes her as well. I think he was expecting, some super sexy Egyptian queen to marry, but here's an older woman, not giving up power whatsoever, not really interested in him at all. And they probably have the shortest honeymoon in recorded history. It lasts for 11 days before this upstart kills Cleopatra V as well.
No.
And this is something that doesn't go down well with the Alexandrian crowd, because they adored Cleopatra V.
It's
She
this
was the
foreigner
people's
just
princess.
came in and murdered the queen.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
it's
And what they do to him is quite remarkable. They quite literally tear him limb from limb in the gymnasium at Alexandria. They really do. They
quite a
completely tear
workout.
him apart. And now, of course, that means that Egypt has no ruler whatsoever, because the only available ruler is the daughter now of Cleopatra V and Ptolemy X, both of them dead. So this orphaned girl, her name, of course, is Cleopatra Tryphina. She is there but cannot be queen on her own, so they need to find a husband for her. So they scout out and they manage to find one of the sons of Chickpea, still alive, had been sent out of Egypt as a baby by his grandmother, Cleopatra III, who just didn't want him around because she hated Chickpea so much. He'd grown up in Rome and then in the court of Mithridates of Pontus, and now he was invited back to Egypt to marry his niece, and that's what they do. He becomes Ptolemy the 12th. She is Cleopatra the 6th. And it's this Cleopatra the 6th that gives birth, of course, to Cleopatra the 7th, the famous Cleopatra, the Liz Taylor Cleopatra. And I don't know if you or your listeners have been following the recent Netflix debacle about the documentary called Queen Cleopatra.
Is this
the
whole ethnicity thing?
A black actress. Yeah. So Cleopatra is played by a black actress, and that the justification for that was, and has been for a while in scholarship, is that we do not know the name of Cleopatra the Seventh's mother. But in my book, I argue that we do know exactly what her name is, and she's a Ptolemaic princess, Cleopatra the 6th. It's because she doesn't appear in any of the Greek or Roman sources. That's why.
Right.
But we have to look at the Egyptian sources. We have to look at the indigenous
Don't
evidence.
go mad, Lloyd. Don't go mad. What?
This is what we often tend to do. We privilege classical sources over indigenous sources. This was the whole emphasis of my book Persians, of course. And it's what I've done here again, is to try to get to the heart of these women through the indigenous Egyptian sources as much as possible. Because when we look at these women through foreign lenses, then of course they're going to come over as abstract, strange, because these foreigners, Greeks and Romans, writing about Egypt, do not understand the Egyptian system, and therefore they castigate these women very often as these kind of villainesses more than anything else. I think it's true that sometimes it's hard to like some of the Cleopatras, but at the same time, it's hard to dismiss them as insignificant. In a world where family was power and family was empire, then basically what went on within the bedrooms and the dining halls of palaces had political consequences. And the personal dynamics between these women and between the women and the husbands and sons had repercussions, which really did shape the Hellenistic world. And I think it's very important always to put the personal back into politics. And I think we see that, I think, now in British politics more and more. We are realizing again how individuals can shake the system. We're seeing it all the time right now. But I think for a long time, historians have forgotten about the personal, and looking at the bigger economic picture, for instance. But my argument is always that history is made by individuals, and the Cleopatras really show us how individual women are movers and shakers in the Hellenistic world.
Yeah, I think you've proved that very well, don't you think, Chris?
Absolutely. I was going to say, which is why the final question I've written is, why do the Cleopatras matter? And I think you've answered that in the last 40 minutes, just how pivotal they are, and just show the basis of how to be a successful ruler in the ancient period.
Absolutely. And it's not about hand-holding and necessarily what we would say doing the right thing. But they had their means and their methods.
Doing the right thing as a ruler in the ancient world, in the late Hellenistic world, is a completely different thing to...
Precisely. And I think that's what, I had to do to get my head around these women, to make them palatable, or even, to work alongside them, to write their biographies, really, was to recognize that tremendous gap between the mores and ethics of the Hellenistic world and ours, and yet at the same time, some fundamental human realities that simply do not change, regardless of time or space. And I think I always find that really an amazing conundrum, really.
It's always difficult to not put 20th century morals on 21st century morals onto the historical period you're studying. So
absolutely,
the idea outside of Sheppey, because I can say that, the Isle of Sheppey, Sister Wives is such a it's such a moralistic minefield. But in ancient Egypt and Sheppey, it's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and
there's only one bridge on and off the island.
It's particularly difficult when it comes to ancient history to remove your own worldview from what you're looking at, and especially when you're talking about something like the famous Cleopatra, who is a part of English literature, for heaven's sake.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the famous Cleopatra has been claimed by every generation of the West, certainly, since her suicide. Everybody has filtered themselves through Cleopatra. She's become a champion for Black Lives Matter, for the Me Too movement, for whatever. We can claim Cleopatra. And I think that's fine, absolutely. Ancient history is an open field for all of this, for the good and for the bad. But at the same time, it's important to drill down to the facts as well, and base ourselves on those as much as we can. And the fact is that Cleopatra VII, for all of her brilliance, was actually just one in a long line of brilliant and ambitious queens who shared a name, who shared a bloodline. And I think that Cleopatra VII, because she was a smart cookie, without a doubt, Plutarch tells us how intelligent this woman was, and she really was. Great charisma and great intelligence. She knew her family history. And that is really proved by the fact that when she is given the title by Mark Antony, Queen of Kings, she also adopts the title Cleopatra Basilissa Thea Notera, Queen Cleopatra, the newest goddess, picking up therefore on what her great-great-grandmother Cleopatra III had done, and going one step further again. She knew the women of her family, without a doubt. And just as a sort of coda, maybe to finish as well, just the name Cleopatra itself, for these women had a mythological ring. There were several Cleopatras in Greek myth. In history, Alexander the Great's sister was called Cleopatra. So that gives them a pedigree. But most importantly, it's the meaning of the name itself. So it's derived from two Greek words, kleos, which is a Greek word for glory or honor or renown, and then patros, which is of the father or fatherland. So really the name means something like the glory of the father or the glory of the fatherland, the renown of your ancestors, whatever it may be. And I think that each of them, even if they weren't actually born with the name Cleopatra, opted to take Cleopatra as their throne name. And I think that's probably what we're dealing with, because they wanted to put that idea forward that they were the renown of their country. So when Cleopatra VII calls herself Cleopatra Philopatros, is the second epithet she takes, the beloved of her fatherland, what she was doing there, of course, was saying, this is all about Egypt. And I think that's what all of the Cleopatras were doing in that choice of that name. They were all queens for Egypt. Egypt was the thing that they kept their eye on more than anything else.
Mm. And I'm sure you will adequately expand on that in the new book, which I'm very much looking forward to now.
Good. Yes, it's out towards the end of May, I believe, published by Wildfire in Britain and by Basic Books in the United States.
Been really interesting, and thanks for coming on, Lloyd. I've actually learned
You're
quite a bit,
very welcome.
sort of reading through the book and quietly listening to you guys.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed speaking to you both. Thank you very much indeed.
So, as always, we'll have the book on our online bookstore at bookstore.org, where if you buy it from us, the author gets a bit more money, we get a little bit of money, and Amazon won't be able to continue to fund Death Stars and intergalactic conquest, which I believe they're doing, allegedly. Again, you can also support us on a one-off donation at Ko-fi to feed my Coke habit, or Tango, I'm not picky. And also for a longer subscription at Patreon, where you could win such stunning prizes as selfies of me, some of my hair while stocks last. No, it's not going to hang around forever. And also, if you're really lucky or unlucky, you can get a dinner date with me. So these are all options for you to think about. And thanks again for listening. And just before you go, do leave a 5-star review. It's free. Just do it. It's fine. It's fine. Do it.